Welcome everyone to Not That Media. My name is John, and in this series of videos I will be giving 31 film recommendations across 31 days. I'll be giving brief, spoiler-free synopsis and highlighting a particular scene that has made this one of my personal favourite films to watch in October. There will be something funny, something spooky. It won't always be Halloween, but there will be certainly some scary stuff in there. So come along with me as I count down my 31 days of Halloween. Night of the Living Dead is widely considered to be one of cinema's seminal horror movies. It launched the career of George A. Romero and brought zombies very firmly into the public consciousness. It was made on a shoestring budget, and the film is now acknowledged as a classic of its genre, casting the influences over so many horror films and television series for the last 50 years. While placing flowers on the grave of her father, Barbara is attacked by a lumbering, mysterious figure. She flees the scene, seeking sanctuary to a nearby farmhouse where she meets Ben, who has arrived in a pickup truck. But the farmhouse is soon surrounded by more of these mysterious figures, driven by a savage and unearthly hunger for human flesh. With a handful of other survivors, Ben and Barbara face a grim fight for their very survival. As a George A. Romero fan, I might be prejudiced, but I don't think it's unfair for me to sit here and say that Night of the Living Dead deserves its position as an iconic movie in horror history. Without Night of the Living Dead, we would have very little to no zombies. It created the zombie in its modern iteration. So all the Walking Dead, Shaun of the Dead, Call of Duty zombies, Return of the Living Dead, all these franchises, whatever you want to name them, all of them owe a debt to George A. Romero's Night of the Living Dead. So as part of this 31 Days of Halloween, I wanted to talk about the very first scene, and in fact the very first zombie we meet, because I find it interesting that when you go back and watch that zombie, he's actually very different to what would become considered the norm. And in fact, I would argue that influences within that scene would then later pay off in George A. Romero's Land of the Dead, but I'll talk about that in a moment. The opening scene of Night of the Living Dead is iconic, and I think if you're like me, when you get to your horror films, you like to get a little bit of a range. Whilst it's great to see brand new movies with fantastic new effects and up-to-date top acting and all this kind of stuff, there's something about that first Night of the Living Dead, those eerie static shots of the car driving to the cemetery, that slightly off music from the 1960s. It feels like the beginning of an episode of The Twilight Zone. It's very prevalent at that moment in time that when you're watching it, it doesn't feel like a zombie film. But at the time, what was a zombie film? Nobody knew. We then meet Barbara and Johnny, who are attending a grave, and they are taking a wreath. Johnny makes a fantastic and humorous remark about the fact that the wreath that they bring every time they drive, this 4-hour drive there, 4-hour drive back, they bring a wreath, but what happened to last year's wreath, or the year before that wreath? So Johnny makes a rather funny joke, is that chances are the local cemetery owner is coming in, sweeping up these wreaths, and then reselling it to them. So every year, how many times have we bought the same wreath and been laying it on the grave? It's exactly the kind of, it just kind of sums up the character straight away. It's very innocuous, it's very light-hearted. Obviously Barbara is more focused on cleaning and tending the grave, but Johnny is just making light of the situation. And then they start to make the jokes about being spooked in the cemetery, and the iconic line from Johnny, "They're coming to get you, Barbara," is then said for the very first time. This happens to coincide with a figure walking through the graveyard. He doesn't look like he's up to much, but something looks a little bit off about him. He's walking in a very slightly strange way, but Barbara dismisses it, and Johnny says, "Look, there's one of them now." And Barbara, this fantastic 60s acting, just turns around and goes, "Stop it, you're ignorant." And he goes, "Quick, I'm getting out of here." This man then approaches Barbara and proceeds to attack her. Now, what I would say about this scene is that obviously, if you're paying attention, if you know anything about the franchise, this is clearly a zombie. This is the first zombie we meet on screen. But he's not bloody, he's not a pulp, he's not a mess, he's not drooling, he's not trying to bite her in any great thing. He grabs her, and it almost looks like he wants to strangle her. I think it's fantastic that it's introduced in a way, and I think the remake, and I do enjoy the remake, I think the remake got this wrong to a slight degree because they went straight in with the macabre. But as this is the very first scene, this looks like a normal man attacking and assaulting a woman in a cemetery. Sadly, something that obviously can happen in true life. Obviously, zombies are a work of fiction, but it's entirely possible that sadly things like this happen. But then when Johnny attempts to defend his sister, this zombie does not try to bite him, it does not try to rip a chunk out of him. Instead, it slams his head into a grave and proceeds to kill Johnny. This is a very different zombie from what we would see later, which is why I wanted to hold it up, because I find it interesting to say, look, if you have a prejudice towards the zombie, it's boring, we've seen it all. Actually, Night of the Living Dead has this fantastic preface that there was no rules in this movie. The zombie as we know it today was not established. Shooting it in the head and destroying the brains and all that kind of stuff, none of that was established yet. Romero was, I'm not saying he was making it up as he was going along, because clearly there was a script, but the rules were not firmed up. So I recommend watching this scene, not only because it has the iconic "They're coming to get you, Barbara," but we get to see a very different version of the zombie. Now, my personal headcanon on this is that this is the first day of the zombie outbreak. Things are in motion. So perhaps because the bodies are so fresh and because they're so new, it is retaining a little bit of its brain. Obviously, we will learn in a later movie, Land of the Dead, that over time the zombies do begin to recall their basic functions and begin to operate in a slightly more human element. But that was many years in the future. But I do think that George was drawing upon this very first zombie as inspiration for Land of the Dead. To continue the scene though, having witnessed Johnny die, Barbara quite rightly runs away. But the problem is, when she gets in her car, it's not her car, it's Johnny's. And of course, she doesn't have the keys. So she locks the doors. Now, again, what I find more threatening about this particular zombie is this is a zombie that runs up and it tries to open the door. It actually literally has its hand on the handle and is trying to open it. It then turns around, goes over and picks up a rock and throws it at the window and breaks the window like a common thug and a common criminal. This is not a normal zombie. This is not the zombies we would later understand. And I think it's fascinating, which is why I recommend watching this movie, just to see that beginning, that early day. As the film goes on, the zombies do start to become a little bit more ghoulish. I don't even think they're called zombies in the very first Night of the Living Dead. I'm pretty sure they're referred to as ghouls. So that's why I wanted to include it. And whilst, as I've said maybe before, other iterations of the Living Dead franchise are better, have got better actors, better directing from Romero, etc., always go back to the beginning with Night of the Living Dead. It's so out of nowhere, this zombie attack. It is so cold and callous. It's not about eating flesh, it's just about anarchy. And I think it's a really cool way to set a tone for a movie. The rest of the film is fantastic. It's got some really cool scenes, really great acting, too many great scenes to name. I strongly recommend, if you've never seen it, to definitely do watch at least Night of the Living Dead. Give it a chance. It's got a really surprise ending, which certainly at the time was considered very controversial due to its main actor, but that's a story for another day. I think it's a great time. I think it's well worth watching. I keep it in my Halloween rotation because sometimes when you just want to watch that kind of creepy black and white old school movie, I kind of feel like Night of the Living Dead is the movie to put on the watch list for your 31 days of Halloween. So until next time, stay scared.
They're coming to get you, Barbara.
Stop it! You're ignorant.